So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to indicate with a show of hands. I know some of you. How many of you have taken blank out? 342. Sorry, 317. What the AI course? Okay, just a couple. Okay, not a huge number. Okay. So in the AI course, did you cover decision trees? Or was that one of the topics covered? Okay, okay. Others, how many of the others in the room who have not taken 317 covered decision trees before in class? Okay, 306, you did a few? Yeah, okay, okay. Any others? Okay, so we're gonna need to cover those as part of it. That material will be important. I'm going to get to that in a little bit, and it will be a key outcome of this class that you're going to want to pay very close attention to, how decision trees work. But I want to first set some context with this work. Okay? The context for this work is actually local. And it has to do with this thing called West Nile virus. Anyone here of West Nile virus? Okay. What do you know about West Nile virus?
Most spread by mosquitoes.
Good, good. It's spread by mosquitoes. Anyone else want to offer anything? It's one thing is it can kill you. It has killed people here in the province. It paralyzes people. It can cause permanent damage for your life that you retain for your life that really affects your health status. It's also the case that our province here has worldwide the highest level of West Nile infection for this type of West Nile virus. There's another type in Africa that's much milder, but it's this type of this province has the highest rates worldwide for West Nile virus, and particularly years 2003, 2007, when many of you were probably pretty young. West Nile was had very heavy role to play in sort of making people sick within this province. And our particular city had a large fraction of the cases there. Now, for most years, though, there's been very little in the way of new cases of this. Some years there's thousands of cases, and then some years there's almost none. Some years many people die. Most years maybe one person, maybe none die. So there's orders of magnitude of difference in the number of people affected year to year. And more than that, in terms of knowing about whether it's going to be a bad year, you really don't know it until partway into the summer. You can't really tell well ahead of time. The basic deal here, and this is just to provide you with a concrete case of what we're going to be talking about in the application of this material, is we have a mosquito. And mosquito, I think everyone in the room has seen mosquitoes at a certain level. Here in the province, they come in various types. There's one particular type called Felix tarsalis that's predominantly responsible here. But basically it bites different types of things. Its preferred biting is of people. They actually, believe it or not, mosquitoes go after certain types of prey. There's mosquitoes that like to bite deer, there's mosquitoes that like to bite small mammals, and there's mosquitoes that like to bite people, okay? So this type of mosquito likes to bite people, and it sort of bites around your ankles, hence the tarsalis name. But it also bites birds, and it bites other mammals like horses. And it turns out that in contrast to horses and people, birds can spread the virus back to mosquitoes. So a mosquito will bite them, they'll get really sick, and the mosquito can pick it up from them and get it into its system, and then bring it to other animals too, including to people. People are what are called dead-end carriers. Unlike malaria, they can't get the bug from us. The mosquitoes can't. They just give it to us. But they can kill you, these sort of mosquitoes. And basically mosquitoes go through a life cycle that's rather articulated, but basically they lay eggs, basically it's female mosquitoes that bite people. They lay eggs, they hatch into these things called larvae and then pupae, and then they become adults again. And the females will bite, and the males just sort of just go along for the ride. And mate with the females, but don't really bother people. Turns out that mosquitoes have an incredibly strong dependence on certain things in the environment. Temperature is one of the big ones. Does anyone remember 2007? Okay, good. I'm glad someone does. Do you remember what was distinguishing about that summer in terms of some of these factors here?
It was really humid that summer.
Super humid and super hot. It was, I remember July 1st, Canada Day, it was up in the 30s, I think, and it was really high humidity. So there had been a lot of rainfall in June, and the temperature was really high. And what happens when you combine temperature and humidity with mosquitoes?
They breed a lot.
Yeah, they breed a lot, and so there are tons of mosquitoes there. Remember staying in an RV, and when we'd come outside, it was pretty bad. And then it turns out there's some issues with humans also, by which they might get more exposed or less exposed. If it's really nice weather out, people tend to go outside more. If it's really, really hot, people might, and this is something I'll be learning from one of the teams here, might or might not want to buy bug spray, for example, or might or might not apply bug spray to help keep the mosquitoes off. And if it's really rainy, people tend not to go outside much. So this is the basic deal that we're going to be facing with modeling today, this session. So there's several orders of magnitude difference in the number of cases that are encountered year to year. And the best policy for one year may be really wasteful for another year. So it's not a matter of finding the best policy and just standardizing on it year to year to year. It's actually a matter of needing to make decisions over time, taking into account how many mosquitoes there are, how many of them have West Nile, and the current environmental conditions. If it's going to get really hot later, it may be that you need to take action in a way that's not there if it's going to be cooling down. Or maybe if the mosquito population is low now, you don't need to do anything. If it's really, really high, you need to undertake some action to reduce the breeding grounds for mosquitoes, for example. So this is the deal. This is the basic situation that frames the problems we'll be talking about today. I basically characterize there as being two types of problems. And for most of this course, we focused on the first type. Basically, you need to make choices. You need to make them based on some sort of situations that either don't matter much or are pretty much fixed. They're outside our control, and they're not hugely uncertain in terms of their impact on the system. So here we'll build models. They'll give an understanding of how effects of different choices will change things based on some sort of expected conditions, and we can just go with that. In other words, I try to identify one single plan that will work in pretty much all years. So we're trying to figure out, the best vaccination plan. If there's an outbreak of pertussis or if there's an outbreak of flu, how do we go about vaccinating people? We don't need to worry hugely about all the vagaries of what temperature is it outside or how many people how many people are out of town right now or what have you. It's a pretty defined sort of problem. By contrast, there's a type of problems where you need to make decisions over time, whose impact is going to be hugely affected by things outside your control, things you're not sure about, things like temperature, rainfall, etc. So here, the dynamic model, the simulation model is part of it, but you need to take into account the uncertainties. And these sort of problems are tougher. We need to make decisions that are adaptive, that take into account changing circumstance. So for the first type of problems, we don't have to worry that much about external conditions. They're known or they're unimportant. And we just identify and seek to stick to some plan, some optimal plan. By contrast, this is the type that we're dealing with now. Rather than putting for the second type of problem, where it's highly dependent in terms of the outcome of a policy on what's going on externally, rather than putting all our eggs on one basket and investing in one policy, we avoid a preset plan. We don't plan on one thing, doing one thing. Instead, we make our plans adaptively as we observe what's going on in the world. So in other words, what we do over time depends on what we observe. Okay? So in this case, what we observe may be things like the environmental conditions, the current temperature, the current rainfall, the level of mosquitoes, and we'll make decisions accordingly. We don't make one plan. We instead have a set of possible plans we'll put into place depending on what goes on. So these are what I call adaptive decision problems. And the real question here, it's a tough one. How do we make decisions now when the choice of the best decision depends a lot on what's going to play out later and things beyond our control? How do we make a decision now? We're not sure what's going to happen next week, 2 weeks from now. And even should we make a decision now, despite these uncertainties, or should we wait to see how things are trending? Should we hold off for now? Why invest now? Well, it may have a big impact. To be able to invest now, it'll have a much sooner impact. On the other hand, holding off, we'll have a much better sense of where things are going over the next few weeks, and we may be able to make sort of more wise decisions based on it. Okay? So these adaptive decision problems, we can't count on one particular thing happening. Choosing the decision now requires considering all these possibilities of what might happen. We don't want to make a decision now if we're not taking into account it could cool off, for example. We need to take that into account in our plans. How likely is it to cool off versus to warm up? How likely is it to rain in the next week? And we make decisions not once at the beginning of the summer, but over time as we see things unfold. So the longer we wait, the more information we have, but maybe the less chance we have to actually change things because it's too late. The cat's out of the bag. And we may want to engage in a wait and see to see how things play out, or we may wish to undertake early. Kind of a stitch in time saves nine. So we're balancing these two desires, to seize the moment and act early. Act now, you can head a lot of things off, or to wait and see what's going on, and we have to respond. So these are the types of balances we want to make, okay? And what decision we make now needs to take into account our current situation, possible future eventualities, and the fact that we may be able to re-examine our decision tomorrow or the next day. It's not our final cut now. We need to be able to reason about the fact that we have many choices still to go. So in this case, what we're going to be doing is combining, on the one hand, a simulation model with a decision tree. And the way in which these are going to play out is simulation model is going to give decision tree consequences that it considers, and the decision tree is going to help inform the simulation model about uncertainties and decisions to be made. So we're going to be focusing for the next 15 or 20 minutes very specifically on decision trees. Okay? And I need you to learn this stuff at a quantitative level because it'll be one of the types of modeling, although not per se dynamic modeling, that we use in this class. Okay, so here we're going to be using decision trees in a quantitative way. They can be used to kind of diagrammatically show set of possible choices and outcomes. But we're going to be using them quantitatively. And specifically, what they're going to represent is a couple things. They're going to represent a situation unfolding over time. So time will be part of it, the flow of time. Things are changing over time. Where you have to make decisions over time in the context of uncertainties over time. Uncertainties that you don't know how it's going to turn out until that time. And there's consequences. Outcomes, if you make these set of decisions with these outcomes for uncertainties, you'll get certain consequences. So these are the three types of constructs we're going to be using in the context of decision trees. And we're going to put them together into a tree. A tree that's going to be structured with multiple levels. So we have three types of nodes, and I need you to know these nodes. First will be a decision node. Okay. Here, we're making a choice between a bunch of decisions. Now, I emphasize this because every year on the final exam, some people get confused about this. With a decision node, there's no uncertainty. We elect which choice we want to prefer, okay? There's no probabilities associated with this. It's our choice, and we choose accordingly. And typically we choose the choice the decision tree suggests is best. So a decision node is up to us on this outcome, and it will have one or more outcomes. Second of all, there's what's called a chance node, and that's the green one here. I'm not sure why it's offset here. So here, there's some uncertainty, and it's a discrete uncertainty, meaning it has only a number of possible values coming out. I've shown 3 here. In general, it could have n possible values, where n is 1 or more. And for this case, each of the possibilities is associated with a probability. In this case, we have probably 0.5 of possibility 1 occurring, probability 0.3 of the second one, and probability 0.2 of the third one. These are possible outcomes from this event. So this event might be something associated, for example, with level of rainfall or level of temperature experienced. Maybe this is less than 20, 20 to 30, greater than 30 degrees, something along those lines. Or it could be, outcomes associated with something like the number of people that are outside and engaged in recreation. So here we have different discrete outcomes. It's a set of possibilities, defined possibilities, each with probability. And this probability is going to be really important in our calculations. So you got to pay attention to it. So let me again highlight the fact. Decision node, there's no probabilities, it's just choices. We determine what we want. With events nodes, we don't get a choice. Nature hands us one of these outcomes. We can't choose. It just, they happen with certain probabilities, and we need to be ready for any of these. And then finally, there's something called a consequence node, or terminal node. These are at the far ends of the tree, the so-called leaf nodes of the tree. Okay, and we'll see some trees where we have those in place. Okay, now, let's take a look at a tree. This is an example tree. Okay, so terminal nodes are in these far ends. They are leaf nodes of the tree. And each of the leaf nodes is associated with some outcome, some consequence. These are typically numbers. They might specify, for example, the costs that are born here. Might specify the number of people dying from West Nile virus, the number of people getting sick from West Nile virus, or some combination of them. But they're associated with a single number within the version of the trees we're looking at here. Okay? So you could pick sort of how you measure that. So that's associated with these nodes here. And you'll notice that some of these branches here have outcomes shown at a different depth. That's fine. The point is all of the leaf nodes of the tree have associated with them an outcome. Okay? Now, here we have at the root of the tree what sort of node? What sort is this? This is based on the coloration I introduced just a minute ago, and based on the fact that this does not have probabilities associated with it, what would this be? It's a decision node. It's a decision node. It's always shown as colors are kind of immaterial. What really matters for recognizing it is it's a square node. That's universal. Square nodes, decision nodes. Okay? Okay, decision node. So here we could choose in week 1 to do nothing. Wait and see. We'll just wait to see how the temperature goes. Or we may choose to engage in some sort of action, source reduction. We'll try to go and actively drain the areas where mosquitoes were born. There's cases where people will release dragonflies to try to eat the mosquitoes. Other cases where people will engage in what are called larviciding. So they put some types of chemicals in water so the larvae die. Or adulticiding, where they actually will fog an area and spray it. It's been done in Estevan, and in our province it's seen as a bit extreme, but Winnipeg uses it actually quite a bit historically. Okay, so here we have different possible choices that could be made at that time. I want to emphasize all of these nodes are occurring at certain times. And time is going to the right here. We have week 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. Now, this node is a what sort of node? Chance node or event node. You can use different names for it. And there's two possible outcomes here, whether the temperature is closer to 20 degrees or 30 degrees. And each of those, although it's not shown here clearly, each of them has a probability associated with it. And over time, there may be many such types of nodes. So here's another decision node, another event node. And in this tree, you see an alternation, which is a pretty common pattern. So it's almost like a little game, you versus nature, in a way, in the sense that you're making a choice, nature hands you a card. You know, it's really hot. You have to decide what you're going to do then. And, you know, nature takes another step. They make their play. Okay, it cools off. Okay, and it's not adversarial. They're not trying to get at you. You're not trying to stop them per se, but you're trying to prevent like costs from occurring, or you're trying to prevent deaths from occurring. So you have this kind of nested series of trees with time going to the right. And as you go down the tree, you learn more, right? You say, oh, it's been a really hot summer so far. But as you go down the tree, this is critical, you have less and less choice to actually change the situation, right? It's like the further along you are, the more you know about the situation and how the situation is going to be, but the less control you have over it, right? Because you have less weeks to actually make a difference. It's a bit like a construction project that's underway, or a software project for that matter. By the time you know it's in real trouble, you often have less flexibility to change things. Those requirements really bungled things up, but now that we're down the road, we can't easily go back and change them as easily if we had just been more careful up front. So the point is, we have these successive nodes, these successive times, and we're going down one path here. Which outcome we have from a decision node is up to us, which path we go down. What path we go down from a chance node is not up to us. It's just up to nature. It's up to the situation in the world, you know, whether this occurs or that occurs. But we're going down exactly one path. And in general, we call a path like this a scenario. It's one scenario that plays out over time. We don't know which it's going to be, but we can shape it by choosing at the decision nodes. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'd like to talk about how these decision trees are used, okay? So the basic, one of the foremost uses of decision trees, it's by no means the only one, but it's a very, very, very popular one, very important one, is identifying what's called the optimal decision rule, okay? So I told you earlier that with these adaptive decision problems, it's typically not a matter of choosing one policy, making one choice and sticking by it. That'd be crazy, because you may see very different circumstances which would motivate a different choice. So instead, what we try to do is have an adaptive system where we'll make different choices based on what we have observed. So we're not looking for an optimal policy, we're looking for an optimal what's called decision rule. So if you tell me what's going to happen over time in terms of the chance outcomes, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll tell you what choices I'll make. That's what we're looking for. A kind of rule that you tell me what's going to happen, I'll tell you what I'm going to do, and I'm looking for a rule like that that's going to give me the best outcomes. Best outcomes in terms of sort of average consequences is normally how it's phrased. This sort of decision rule needs to be robust, right? Because you can hand me some circumstances of widely different sorts, and I need to be prepared for any of them. I need to be prepared for a wide variety of possible outcomes. In short, my policy needs to be very responsive and flexible and resilient to possible outcomes. Okay, now, how do we identify these sort of decision rules that are desirable. Now, this is a very technical process, okay? And it's going to involve use of this tree that we just saw. So it's going to involve a recursive procedure working its way up from the terminal nodes of the tree all the way up to the root. Okay? Terminal nodes to root of the tree. We're going to be working our way back. Recursive in the sense that we're not going to go up and then have to go down again. We're just going to work our way successively up, applying this rule at each successive layer until we're at the root. Okay? So what is this rule we're going to apply? What is this rule that's going to give us indication of what decisions we can make at each decision point along its way? Well, I'm going to give you the rule now. And a prime outcome is going to be exactly that. For each decision node, whether the one at the root or along the way, it's going to give us a recommendation of what to do if we reach that point. Okay, so here's the rule. Okay? And I do expect you to know this. Okay. For terminal nodes, for them, so for each node, we're going to determine its value. And we're going to decide for decision nodes which way we're going to go. For a terminal node, you pass up the value. Just use the value. Very simple. The only real choice is for event nodes and decision nodes. And for the sake of the final exam, I'd like you to pay very close attention to the differences between these. For event nodes, what you're going to be taking is the expected value of the values of the children. Okay? So if you have an event node and you have x1 for possibility 1, or say v1 for value, v for value, v1 for possibility 1, v2 for possibility 2, v3 for possibility 3. When I say take the expected value, what do I mean? Can anyone give me a formula for what this will be for the node here? Do you remember from your probability course or a stats course? Do you remember how to take the expected value of something? Anyone remember that?
Is it the probability times the value?
Yeah, exactly. And the sum up over them. So give me a formula. So if we call v1 the value of this node here, v2, v3. Remember, we're computing it from the bottom up. So we've already computed the value of these guys, of these children, when we want to compute the value of the parent. So if we have v1 for the top, v2, and then v3 for the bottom, give me the formula for the parent for this, green guy here on the left. What's the formula?
0.5 v1 plus 0.3 v2 plus
Exactly.
2 v3.
Exactly. 0.5 v1, 0.5 and this guy here times the appropriate value, plus 0.3 v2 plus 0.2 times v3. Okay? So this makes sense. I mean, if there's only one certain outcome, if v1 was certain and the other two were 0, the value for the parent, we use the value same as the value for the child, for example. If each of them were equally likely, it would weight them equally. Let's suppose there were two of them, each would be 0.5 times v1, 0.5 times v2. It would just weight them equally in terms of its valuation for the parent here. Okay? So that's the expected value. Okay? And that's for event nodes, because event nodes are the ones which have possibilities. They have these probabilities, these guys here, associated with them. Remember, we don't choose which of these happens. We have to be prepared for any of them happening. So our valuation for the parent, this is the value of the parent node, it has to take into account the fact that any of these could happen. Does that make sense? If something really, really bad happens at v3, we need to consider that in the formula for v parent, because we can't choose. If something really good happens in v1, we want to factor that in, but we also need to take into account it may not happen. There's a chance v2 or v3 may happen, right? So we need to consider all of them at some level. And that's what that's doing. It's taking an expected value. Okay. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, For decision nodes, the deal is very different. And this is where students often get confused. For decision node, we have the choice about what to choose to do. Decisions are up to us. We can choose which child we would like. It has no probabilities because it doesn't need them. We are choosing, okay? So we're going to select here whichever child offers the best value and pass that one up. Now, sometimes this is the highest value, sometimes it's the lowest value. Like if we're dealing with our tree, if these guys down here are costs, we're going to prefer the choice that leads to the least cost. If these guys down here are deaths, we're going to prefer the option that leads to the least death. By contrast, if these are something good, if these are something like number of life years lived for the population, or the number of deaths averted or something, then we'll choose more. So depending on the nature of what we have here in terms of the consequences, the one that we select will be different. But the main point is we can select it. We choose which the outcome we're going to have. Okay, so this is really important. And I want to highlight two things about this, where again students get confused. Point one. We are determining here this rule. So if we have, so this will be for an event node. This will be for an event node. For a parent decision node, we're going to have something like its value equals the max. Let's just assume that more is better in this case. The max of V1, say V2, V3. No probabilities involved because we're choosing. Not anything where we're handed the decision like we are with an event. Here we're actually choosing which one to prefer. So here I'd say it might be the max, and in general if we had more, those would be also elements of the max. So this determines the value, but beyond that we're interested in something very important. We're interested in which of these did we choose, okay? Which was the choice? Because that's going to be the recommended outcome if you get here. If the situation is such that you end up at this point, which one is going to be the best one for you to choose? That's what's going to be recommended. You're not only considering the max, you're figuring out which of these is the max, and you're using that as your preferred choice. Okay? So what's going to come out of this is a decision rule, as we'll see in just a minute. Okay? So let's consider a given case here. So suppose you're creating a desktop software app, and it's dependent on, it's running on Macs, and there's going to be a new version of OS X rolled out, and you have to decide, okay, you understand there's a ship date for this OS X Puma of such and such a thing. And the question is, in your software, do you build-in support for these new features in a way that relies on it, or not? And are you going to ship it basically relying on these features or not? And that's the desirable choice to make here will depend on the probabilities that it's delayed and that it ships on time, and the outcomes for each of these possibilities, what the choices are. So if you do rely on the new OS features and the OS ships in time, maybe you're expecting to have some gain in the amount of revenue that you get. On the other hand, if it's delayed and you are shipping this product or you're providing it to your IT clients, then it's going to be really bad. There's going to be all sorts of waiting and lost time for your clients, and therefore you're going to lose $200,000. So here you have this situation where you're going to need to make a choice. In this case, it's just one choice, depending on this uncertain outcome and having some uncertainties as quantified by these probabilities as well as by these outcomes. So you're going to have to balance, it's very likely we'll do well to build these in, but there's some possibility it'd be really bad if the OS is delayed. Which is the desirable outcome? That's the question. That's the issue that a decision tree will help you identify. Which of these choices would be most desirable. So you can tell me, given by the rules that we've articulated here, given by this general characterization, which of these would be the more desirable choice?
Relying on it.
Okay, so let's figure out. I like what I'm hearing. So let's work our way back up. So for these nodes here, these nodes at the bottom, what are their values? Well, 50,000, 200,000. You just read them up, minus 200,000. How about for this one here? What's its value? Give me a formula for it.
0.9 times 50,000.
Good.
0.1 times negative 20,000.
Okay.
which
So,
is 25,000.
so this is 45,000 minus 25,000 or 25,000, right? As the value of this one. Is that right? Yeah. And compared to the value of 0, where that's your baseline sort of revenue, against which these are sort of calculated. This is a gain of 50,000 over that. This is a loss of 200,000 over that. So in general, this would suggest, yeah, it's on average you'll make money by putting in place this these features which count on this OS X support. Okay, but in general, we're going to have multiple layers of this decision tree here. We're not just going to have one layer, we're going to have multiple layers. So there's a question, do we rely on these features? And if the OS is delayed, for example, do we hold off shipping our thing to our customer to do regression tests against the final version of the OS, or do we ship first with the recognition that we may lose in the expected case. In the typical case, we'll lose less money if the feature support stays as expected, but there's some chance that we may be exposed to a bug because we haven't tested against the very final version of the OS, just with a pre-release version, a release candidate. So in this case, we've got to take it, we have two levels of decision. One, whether we rely on these features at all, and second of all, if the OS is delayed, then whether or not we hold off further to do testing, or whether we ship a little bit earlier with comfort. We've only been that we've examined the pre-release candidate, but with still a bit of uncertainty that we might have exposure in the final version of the OS. So here we have a multi-level decision tree, 2 layers of uncertainty associated with whether it's delayed or not, and whether there's uncaught bugs in it, or whether the feature support is as we expected, and then 2 layers of choices as well, with one of those choices being contingent on a certain outcome for the OS. And you could calculate up from this decision tree here, and what it suggests in this case is, once again, you're relying on the OS features. And you'll notice that it puts a little hash mark here, or little X's, little crosses across this one here. Do not rely on new OS features. In other words, we've chosen this other branch, not this one. And if there are several outcomes here, each of them would have this sort of indicator. Okay? So here, this is what's called a rollback. It goes by several different names. It's called a rollback. It's called a backwards induction. You'll sometimes hear it called an element of dynamic programming, but it's basically working from the leaves of the tree all the way up to the root, successively calculating the values of nodes. Okay, now let's talk about decision rules, and then I'll come back to this point. So what is a decision rule? Well, basically a decision rule specifies what to do at any possible outcome, any possible eventuality. If this happens, you'll do this. If that happens, you'll do this other thing. And these decision rules in general are used to identify optimal decision rules through this backwards induction. Exactly this process we saw here. Okay? So let's talk about what this looks like. So here we have some initial decision, and we have some choices, and we have some uncertainties along the way, and perhaps multiple levels of choices and uncertainties. And we have some particular terminal nodes, each of which is associated with a distinct scenario. So consequence 10, for example, here is associated with this scenario highlighted in black. Okay? That's a scenario of possibilities that would yield consequence 10. Now, very importantly, you'll notice, ladies and gentlemen, that some of those possibilities are within our control. The only way consequence 10 is going to come about is if we've made this choice here up front labeled no expansion. This choice here, we have elected that choice, and that's opened up the possibility for consequence 10 happening. But we also need, at this later decision node, to choose a certain way. So these consequences, whether they're possible is up to us for some of them. But they also depend on some things not within our choices, like which way a given event node will go. This event node here, or this event node here, we can't choose which way it will go. We may elect to have no expansion, but we could end up with either any of these consequences down here or the ones up here, and we could selectively choose later to shape them further, but we're not going to be able to definitively say we want consequence 12. That's not up to us. It's also up to nature which way these things go. Does that make sense? Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk a little bit more about the terminology and lead it back to a few particular points. So, there's some terminology here. We talk about two types of decision rules. Remember, a decision rule specifies what you do in any possible eventuality. You tell me a situation, I'll tell you what I do. Okay? So you tell me it's going to be hot, 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 and I'm going to tell you I do this. You tell me it's going to be cool, 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 I'll do that. Tell me it's really rainy but cool, I'll tell you what I'm going to do, etc. Okay, so there's two types of decision rules. One is what's called static decision rule. And here we have a set plan, we stay the course, and that's all we're going to do. No matter what happens, we're going to do the same thing. Okay? In short, it's not adaptive. We're not paying attention to what's going on and changing our decisions accordingly. This is our plan, we're going to stick by it. By contrast, an adaptive decision rule varies its decisions based on what you observe. It learns in a certain sense. And the observation here is these sort of static decision rules, it turns out, are rarely optimal. These set here, these types of decision rules, will often do rather better by choosing according to our observations, by observing, by learning, and making different choices. Okay, so here's an example tree here, and this would be a static decision rule. Why do I say it's static? Why is this decision rule static? If I put this on exam, why would you say that you can recognize that this is static? What is it that kind of is the giveaway for it being static? Remember, with a static decision rule, we choose the same thing no matter what happens at the same point in time. So week 1, why is this suggestive of a static decision rule? Well, we're handed some uncertainty earlier. No matter which way that uncertainty goes, we're going to make the same decision. We're choosing the top choice, which in this case is do nothing. Similarly, down here in week 2, no matter which of these uncertainties played out here, we're making the same choice here. Exact same choice. Our choice is not contingent upon, it's not conditional upon, doesn't depend on, it's not varying by which event occurred. And in fact, this says same as below, so the same structure will be captured up here. So in short, this is a static decision rule here. We're making the same choices week 1, regardless of what came before us in terms of uncertainties. We're making the same decisions week 2, a certain fixed decision no matter what's come before us. That's a static rule. Do you agree with that? Do you understand that? Would you be able to recognize that? Who would like to ask a question about that? Yes, yeah.
For the second decision,
Yeah.
is that,
Week 2?
yeah, one more left. Oh, shit.
This one here. Yeah.
The top branch, are they the same option? They're literally the exact same choice.
They're exactly the same option, and this is one of the ways that decision trees diagrammatically are a little bit overwhelming sometimes, because here you'll have an event occurring, and the different outcomes of the event are captured by different branches, right? But often you'll have the exact same choice, in place, regardless of which way that event played out. Often, not always, but often you're going to have the same set of choices. And so those are shown here with the same structure, and in both cases we've chosen the top one. I see what you're saying though, is because here we have do nothing larviciding, here we have do nothing larviciding, but they're laid out a little bit differently. So I could see why it would be a bit confusing. But the point is we've chosen the same outcome, do nothing, the top one. And therefore the choice was made in a way that didn't depend on, it didn't vary with what previously happened. So we've stuck to plan. We could have said ahead of time, we could have summarized this decision rule by saying, we're going to do nothing, and then larvicide. So week 1, we're going to do nothing. Week 2, we're going to larvicide. That's our decision rule. That's it. Now you'll notice, and this is an important point, that I actually haven't shown decisions for, say, what decision I'd make at this point here in week 2, for this bottom decision rule, or bottom decision node. Why not? Why haven't I actually specified this here?
Because it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. Why doesn't it matter? That's exactly right. It doesn't matter, and why not?
You'll never get there.
Never get there, because I choose to do something different. I don't choose to put in place larviciding, which is what this whole branch is about. So for a decision rule, you actually don't need to consider all possible, the answers to all possible decisions, just those ones that are possible given your previous choices. All right? So this guy here I need to specify because it's a possibility. If I made this decision at week 1, then I might get to this, this point right here. So I do need to specify him. Him, I don't need to specify, nor do I have to specify her, because, I'm not choosing to go down this route. So here we have a decision rule. It is static. We choose the same thing, but we don't have to specify all possible values. Now, let me contrast this with an adaptive decision rule. Now, this varies in some of its details, but the point here is that we're actually making different choices depending on what happened. So if the current temperature was higher here, then we're going to make, this is lower, this is higher. We're going to make a different decision than if it was higher. So here, our choice in week 1 is going to be different depending on what happened before us. Okay? And that's what distinguishes this as an adaptive decision rule. Okay? Adaptive, static. Static, both of these chose the same choice, whereas both of these ones here exhibited different choices based on what was observed. Based on what was observed, you made a different choice. Does that make sense? Static, dynamic. Or static, adaptive. An adaptive decision rule takes into account what has been observed, what has happened to these things outside your control, like the temperature and the rainfall and so on, and factors that into your choices then. Okay. Okay, now, decision trees are, yeah, you have a question?
So sort of going back to
Sure.
the picture.
Sure.
There's still, it's hard to read from here, but there's still an element of static once you get to week.
That's true. Like week 2, I'm actually choosing the same thing. I'm choosing to do adult deciding. So that element is, the decision rule here has some elements that are static, but it's an adaptive decision rule as a whole because it depends somewhat. I can't tell you, one way to think about it is, I can't give you, let me, instead of using it double negatives, I can't give you the fact that I cannot or what have you. For this decision rule, I can actually specify for you without any conditionals what I'm going to do. Week 1, I'm going to do nothing. Week 2, I'm going to larvicide. That's it. No conditional involved. Here, with this adaptive decision rule, for me to specify what I'm going to do, I need conditionals. I need to say, well, if the temperature is high in week 0, then I am going to larvicide. Otherwise, I will do nothing. And then you're right. Week 2, it looks like I'm going to be adulticiding no matter what. But for me to phrase to you any part of the, for me to phrase to you the decision rule, I need at least some conditionals in place. And that's what makes it adaptive. It means that I can't tell you, if you tell me exactly what you're going to do, I'm going to say it depends. It depends on what I see in this way. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Can I just,
Yeah.
What's the point of like the static tree showing the unreachable branches then? Is it like to show the potential?
Sorry, you mean like why is it here?
Yeah.
Well, because this shows us, so it's a great question, why have the tree showing these branches at all? Because with respect to the tree, and I'll go back, here's the tree itself, right? The tree is kind of showing us all possibilities. Now we're going to choose a decision rule that's going to reflect how we want to proceed, but the tree has lots of possible choices and lots of possible outcomes. By itself, it doesn't tell us immediately, what to do for all these things. We have to do backwards induction. We have to do this rollback of the tree, and we have to select at each point, which outcome is best. And having done that, we get what's called the decision rule, this sort of thing. And I think what you're asking is like, why superimpose this at all? Why retain this, right? And I think that's a good question. It shows how the decision rule relates to the underlying tree.
Okay.
It shows a decision rule is layered on this underlying tree, and it's a subpiece of the underlying tree. It's like a subsection of that original tree. And I think that's a useful thing to recognize, that basically when we're finding a decision rule, it can be drawn in an original tree, but it's a subset of it. Okay? Good. Thanks for the question. Other questions about this? I'm delighted to have these questions. Other questions? Okay. So let's talk about this analysis using decision trees. So it turns out decision trees are extremely widely used. They are very widely used in businesses. They're widely used in decision making and lots of different areas in terms of technical decision making as well. And it turns out that people have supplemented them not only with, say, fixed probabilities, but with symbolic components. So you can have a variable within that. And you can try to identify, for example, using a sensitivity analysis, what would the value of the probability have to be to motivate this choice as opposed to that choice. So instead of having, for example, fixed probabilities here for sort of associated with possible outcomes, we'll instead have variables. And we can then say, okay, as we vary these variables, these parameters within the tree, under what conditions would it make sense for me to say rely on the new OS features or not? In other words, under what conditions would it make sense for me to choose this upper choice as opposed to this lower choice? What are the values of these guys here, these parameters here, these probabilities, such that it'll be desirable for me to rely on some new OS features. And it will sort of articulate for you, well, for this region of assumptions about the probabilities, you would choose one versus another. And this is a type of analysis that's widely done with decision trees. And sometimes we take into account many possible outcomes in the decision, in the possible terminal nodes at the same time. Let's go back, though, to how these things are combined with simulation models, because the two come together in a major way. Decision trees are used many times without dynamic models, and dynamic models used many times without decision trees. But for certain problems, they need to work together. And these are these complex dynamic decision problems, where you have a situation. It has feedbacks, nonlinearities, delays, all these things that motivate the use of dynamic modeling on the one hand. but it also has an element of decision making over time in the context of big uncertainties, uncertainties that really matter. So here we're going to have a system dynamics model, say, and a decision tree, and we're going to bring them together. Okay? So a few points about bringing them together. First of all, this is we could do so with a framework that's designed to sort of integrate observation and decision making. It'll capture uncertainties as time progresses, and it will simulate a wide range of possibilities. We're going to be simulating here not one possible scenario, but many scenarios. And you're going to be able to use it to balance the choice of different decisions, including possible wait and see decisions. So let's take a look at what this looks like. Well, on the one hand, we have a simulation model, and on the other, decision tree, and each of them has certain responsibilities. So here, the simulation model is going to be given the role of calculating the scenario outcomes. So if you're in a certain scenario, if you're in one of these scenarios right here, along the bottom, possible scenarios, you're going to need to calculate the outcome of that scenario using a dynamic model. It could be an agent-based model, could be a system dynamics model. We have a version of this running with system dynamics models, and basically that scenario needs to be simulated. And that scenario involves, over time, a certain choice, say at week 0, a certain outcome to this uncertainty, another choice in week 1, another outcome to that uncertainty, etc., down to this final outcome. And it needs to simulate that scenario in terms of all the events and all the choices on the possible outcomes. And that's going to be the job of the simulation model, is to simulate that. By contrast, the decision tree is going to be used to represent over time possible uncertainties and decisions. So the event nodes and the decision nodes, okay? And the consequences as calculated from the simulation model. And so here, really, the decision tree is kind of encapsulating policy space, the set of all possible things which could be done here. It's sort of representing the set of possible choices and the set of possible eventualities. And the simulation model is taking care of calculating those terminal nodes, and then a rollback can be done. Okay, so let's talk about that. So for the case of something like West Nile, simulation model might simulate the mosquito life cycle, the bird life cycle, transmission between them, human infection, cost and resource use. And the decision tree here will capture choices to be made over time, things like larviciding, source reduction, vaccination, advisories, and uncertainties about temperature and various types of consequences, cost, West Nile deaths, West Nile cases, etc. So here you might have, for example, a system dynamics model, you have a decision tree, and you layer them together. Okay. So I said early on that here we're kind of balancing two desires: to act early, simulate an intervention early, see its and gain all of its effects, and then wait and see, where you just hold off making a choice until the situation is clear. So simulation models and decision trees can work together very, very well. The key point here that I need you to know is that in this context, what's going on is that the simulation model is being used to simulate the possible outcomes along each terminal node. And then rollback, this process of doing backwards induction, is being used to calculate all the way back to the beginning of the tree which choice is recommended, and based on that you're identifying a decision rule. Because given a recommendation at a given decision here, that will then start to lead to a decision rule being defined across the entire tree. In this case, we may have, for example, done a rollback along this tree that assigned values for all these nodes. And this node here, the first node, this entry node, was assigned the highest value along do nothing. It was assigned a high outcome. The maximum here was along this path. So this is chosen. By contrast, at this next level, the maximum here was along larviciding on the lower side, or do nothing on the upper side. That was the maximum, the path that led to the maximum value, and hence it was preferred. Now, it's notable that this node here and this node here would be calculated in terms of a value from the bottom up. But we can't know that that's not preferable until we finally have a value associated with each of these nodes. This sort of upper green node here, it's not until we have values for each of these that we can calculate which of these paths is more desirable, which of these children. So in order to do that, we do have to do all this calculation on the way up, but then we only choose the more desirable one of them. So this option is not elected, and it turns out not to be possible because we won't choose that, but it does have to be calculated when doing the roll-up. So here, the simulation model is used to simulate each of these possible outcomes. A given outcome here is going to involve taking into account a series of choices and events over time that lead to that possible outcome, and it will need to take that into account when simulating that outcome. Once you've simulated it, you'll read the value out of the simulation model of the total cost, or the total number of deaths that have occurred, or the number of severe West Nile cases, and you'll use that and consider that in your rollback. Does that make sense as a general strategy? So the simulation model here is used to evaluate terminal nodes, given series for each of them, contingent on a series of events and decisions over time that lead to that particular scenario, that particular outcome. And then a rollback is done. Preferred options are set for each of the decision nodes, and then that articulates a decision rule, such as the one shown here, which is typically going to be adaptive. That adaptive decision rule is going to emerge from an interaction of the simulation model, what it suggests as possible outcomes, and the structure of the decision tree. That's what's going to determine that particular decision rule that looks best. It's going to take into account the results from the simulation as captured by the outcomes for each terminal node and the structure of the decision tree. Does that make sense to people? Are you clear on that decomposition? So the simulation model is responsible for computing outcomes, and the decision tree is responsible for doing the rollback and taking into account the uncertainties and the decisions over time, and coming up, because of that, with a decision rule here. Okay? With a decision rule, and that decision rule may leave out the possibility of reaching certain nodes within the tree, but we wouldn't have known that we don't want to go down that route until we had calculated all the values for that route during bottom-up backwards induction. Are we okay with that? Yes.
When you run the simulation model, you have to do it
Yes.
for as many times as you have.
That's right. Now, there's an interesting research question there. Can you actually lessen the amount of work that you have to do by avoiding recalculation of certain types of information? Because there may be cases where the paths are so similar, you really don't have to do the whole simulation again. And more than that, do you really, let's consider that you have calculated, say, this one here, and now you're going to calculate this one here. The only way they differ is what the outcome of this uncertainty at week, 3, right? And as a result, it's really wasteful to have to recompute, resimulate all the way from the start to the finish. Really, all you have to do is rerun this part of the simulation for this alternative outcome. But one way or the other, you're going to need the simulation model to get you the values of these possible outcomes, because they need to take into account, they need to simulate the effects of these choices over time and these possible events. And in general, that's going to require a simulation model to figure out. With really simple trees, people will try to eyeball these, do a little spreadsheet calculation. But if you're dealing with a complex system, like with West Nile spread among birds and humans and mosquitoes, you're not going to be able to simulate that in a spreadsheet. You're going to need to run a simulation model. Is that helpful? Yeah. Other questions about this before we wrap up? Okay, one final thing I will just note is that there's a very exciting component for those of you who are perhaps in machine learning class right now or interested in data science. There's a very effective technique that combines simulation models on the one hand with machine learning techniques to correct for simulation models. And the idea here is simulation model may be really far off, but with data coming in periodically, you can kind of help it learn and help it through observation and correct it as new data comes in and contain sort of its tendency to wander off. So with new data coming in, you can always keep it kind of up to date, current, and use it to just look forward a little bit and correct it when new data comes in and cause it to look forward a little bit. And the method that we use here, the preferred method that's shown here, is something called particle filtering, and it can be very effective when combined with simulation models. The key element here is that once again, like with the decision tree, you're learning over time. New data comes in, the model is updated, the model is then used to look forward a short period of time, and then when new data is available, it's updated yet again. Parameter values are learned, the states of the model are learned, and over time, it gets more and more savvy as to the current situation. Okay, so critical points here. There's the framework geared towards ongoing observation decision making. It's very different from the situation of just deciding upfront what policy is best. Instead, we need to observe what's going on before we can decide what is best. This framework captures uncertainty as time progresses using a decision tree and a wide range of possibilities, not just a single scenario. By having decisions scattered throughout the system over time, scattered, say, scattered here over time as successive weeks pass, you're able to capture these effects of kind of incremental decision making as things play out over time. And here, the type of combined approach can allow for planning in the context of big uncertainties that really matter for what's best. And they do offer the potential for a model that sort of self-corrects from observations, self-corrects as new data comes in to sort of always incorporate the latest learning, the latest, the best estimate from parameters or model elements that are suggested by incoming data. Okay, so that's all for today. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask you to take a look at a different video for Thursday, and then we'll continue on a different topic. So thanks very much. And if anyone would like to go to office hours, I'll be meeting in 386 as normal.